Ending of Moses, and the presenter is Pat Feeney.
Michael Moran, better known as Zosimus, was born off Fada Lane in the Liberties of Dublin about 1794. When still a baby, he became ill, as a result of which he lost his sight. But he was blessed by an extraordinary memory, and he was able to learn by heart long poems, ballads and songs, read or recited to him. It was as a rhymer, singer and composer of songs that he was to make a living and support his family. He got the name Zosimus from a 5th century holy man of the same name, who featured in a long poem, Saint Mary of Egypt, written by a Dr. Coyle. Zosimus knew this work and was fond of reciting it.
Somebody must have read this to Zosimus over and over, and Zosimus must have been able to memorize this, which was a remarkable feat in its own light, apart from being a reciter. And he then went around the streets of Dublin, and of course he'd been a Dubliner, and he'd been a showman, and he'd been a reciter. He used to throw a bit of an act into it, like he'd put his hand up to his head, and he'd look up to the stars, and he'd mumble a few yada, 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 and then you see them, oh, what's he saying, and he's talking to the gods, and then he'd be inspired, and then he'd start off with Zosimus. But the interesting thing was, he'd say, gather round me, come gather round me, fall the dee, roll the dee, radio. And Yeats was inspired by all this, because Yeats's poem, Come Gather Round Me, Players All, Come Praise 1916, and then Come Gather Round Me, Parnellites, and then The Pilgrim, where he said about your man going into the tavern, and come silk or come rag and stand, come cloak or country shawl, and then he ends up, oh, the roly roll, the roly day, which is, again, taking it from Zosimus. And, of course, he also wrote him up in the Celtic Twilight, The Last of the Gleemen. But, of course, Yeats got it wrong twice. He got it wrong with Romantic Ireland's Dead and Gone, It's with O'Leary in the Grave, with John O'Leary, and then, of course, 1916 breaks out. And then he got it wrong about Zosimus. He said, The Last of the Gleemen. And along comes Harry Yank and Harry Lemon and Shell Shock Joe and the Bugler Dunn and Bang Bang and all these characters of Dublin. So The Last of the Gleemen weren't gone. But there's another lovely poem of Yeats's, the translation of the old Gaelic one in the 14th century, the one about come out of faith and dance with me in Ireland. Yeats has a lovely verse there, one man alone in that outlandish gear. Now that had to be Zosimus, one man alone, and he dressed outlandish with a frieze coat and a cape and a tall silk hat and old brogue shoes. So Yeats was very caught up between this man who was a genius on one score and who was a bit of a ragamuffin, a beggar, but had all the tricks of the trade of the beggar, you know.
His dress consisted of a long, coarse, dark description of frieze coat with a cape, the lower parts of the skirts having an appearance of being mitred or scalloped, an old, soft, greasy brown beaver hat, corduroy trousers, and strong Francis Street brogues. He always carried a long blackthorn stick with a heavy iron ferrule at the end, secured to his wrist by a leather thong or strap, and his hands always resting on the top, as he appears in the photographs just published.
He was known as the tack-em-up man, but he was a minister of the church. He was silenced. He wasn't supposed to say confession, hear confession, and he wasn't supposed to say mass. So he was out in Ranelagh, and of course he let it be known that he wasn't forbidden from marrying people. He was still a priest. And at that time it cost 2 and 6pence, a half a crown, to get married in a church in Dublin. And he did it out in Ranelagh, the tack-em-up man, for a shilling. So, of course, 1 and 6pence saved. He was a very popular man. And also, Ranelagh was a bit like the Bonafide. They got Tompkins Dray out of Cannon Street, and they loaded up Zosimus and Pat Carney, the fiddler, and Joe Brady, the dancer, and Fat Mary, the prima donna, and Oney, the fool, who was as wise as an owl, and Stony Pockets, a fellow who put stones in his pocket in case his head would fly off. And they brought them all out. You can imagine the party, and the bride and groom as well, out to Ranelagh to be married. So that was a very popular. The people didn't seem to mind. He was a priest and he was able to marry, and they were saving 1 and 6 on the deal as well. So I wouldn't say there were white weddings in those days.
Zosimus, though not blessed with sight to behold the fair beauties of nature, was by no means insensible to their influences on him, particularly when the presence of the tender sex awakened those feelings so honourable to our nature as admitted by mankind of every grade in life and every order of intellect. Twice did he venture into the chariot of Venus by doing the connubial, the last time the widow Curran winning the prize of poetic genius and public notoriety. This lady honoured each spouse by an acknowledgement of their reciprocal love and attention, Curran bequeathing a lovely daughter of Erin, while Zosimus added as fine a boy as he could wish to look at, who was named after our patron saint, Patrick. This lad was rather well-looking and might be considered handsome. He grew up an intelligent boy.
Zosimus, he got married twice, believe it or not, because women apparently tend to go for this type of man who, well, he can't see a thing, and here he is reciting, and everyone clapping him and giving him money and all that. And then he had, of course, the whiskey droppings. The bartenders were very shaky in the old hands, and probably for taking an odd nibble during the day. And the Batherton measures were very battered, so there was always a few drops would spill when they'd be poured out a short. And this went on to a tray, and this was known as whiskey droppings. And Zosimus had a contract for going around all the pubs of Dublin. God, I wouldn't mind that contract myself, drinking all the whiskey droppings. And the lovely story about this was, when he died, imposters were getting onto the road and standing on Capel Street Bridge and Francis Street and all that. But there was one other imposter, and he didn't bother standing anywhere. He just went around the pubs claiming the whiskey droppings that he was the real Zosimus.
Zosimus wrote many songs, the best known being The Finding of Moses.
You see, the dub is a strange creature. He's not interested in what's happening in Dublin or Cork or Kerry. The dub wants to go away further, Jerusalem and Egypt. There was a fellow in Inchicore, they used to call him the Pharaoh. So you can imagine, like, you know, it was a very international sort of type of society. So this is how Zosimus then started to write about Moses being found by the king of Egypt's daughter, and she went for a swim along the Nile, and she found the baby in the wad of straw and all that. And then, of course, there was several versions of that. And then Zosimus made up his own. Like, you can imagine this. And this again comes very strong in Yeats.
On Egypt's banks contagious to the Nile, the old Pharaoh's daughter, she went to bathing style. She took her dip and she come unto the land, and to dry her royal pelt she ran along the strand. A bulrush tripped her, whereupon she saw a smiling babby in a wad of straw. She took him up and says she in accents mild, "Turn ages girdles know which he is owns the child." She took him up and she gave a little grin, for she and Moses were standing in their skin. "Be that now," says she, "it was someone very rude, left the little babby by the river in his nude." She took him to her old land, sitting on the throne. "That," says she, "will you give the boy a home?" "Be that now," says he, "sure I've often brought in worse. Go, me darling daughter, and get the child a nurse." An old blackamoor woman among the crew cried out, "Your royal savage wants that to do with you. Your royal ladies is too meek and mild to beget dishonestly this darling little child." Then says Pharaoh, "I'll search every nook, from the Phoenix Park down to Donnybrook, and when I catch hold of the bastard's father, I will kick him from the Nile down to the Dollar." They sent the bellman to the market square to see if he could find a slavey there, but the only one now that he could find was the little young one that left the child behind. She came up to Pharaoh, a stranger Maria, never letting on that she was the baby's ma. And so little Moses got his mammy back, shows that coincidence is not to crank.
But the poem is set in Francis Street, and it opens up by saying, my burial is no concern of me. Just make sure it's in the O'Connell circle. So he wanted to be put in the O'Connell circle. But then he went on to say that he was afraid of the sack-em-ups, and he didn't want anyone chopping them up or cutting them up like a boy. So make sure them fellas weren't around when he was getting buried. So make sure there'd be a watch on his coffin. And then the third thing was, he didn't want any tombstone. This is the lovely part of the poem. He didn't want any tombstone, but what he wanted was a shelter for men. Now, something like Simon, that's what he wanted. And where any rhymer or vagabond could go in and rest, that's what he wanted. And he then said, being blind, he said, I can see Ireland free. I can see Ireland in the distance free. So he could see the freedom coming, even though at that time, 1846, it must have been pretty low, the famine and what have you.
Towards the close of the year 1845, Zosimus was seldom seen in the streets, his health becoming impaired and his speech affected. He was last seen in George's Street, commonly called George's Lane, and when spoken to by several persons, he placed his finger on his lips and made signs to show he could not articulate. Soon after, he became very feeble and took to his bed. About this time, a celebrated Dublin prima donna, enjoying the sobriquet of Big Mary, died, which circumstance was communicated to Zosimus, when he replied, "May the Lord have mercy on her soul," and made the remark, "Ah, Mrs. Webb, it'll be my turn next." He lingered until the following April, when he died. In the latter end of the month of March, 1846, notice of a sick call was left with Mr. Sherwood, clerk of the Church of St. Nicholas of Myra, Francis Street. And with that zeal and promptitude which characterized the ministers of religion, the Reverend Nicholas O'Farrell was in immediate attendance. On arriving at the house, number 15 Patrick Street, he proceeded to the top back room, and to use the words of the reverend gentleman, there I found poor Zosimus lying on a straw pallet on the floor, and the room crowded with ballad singers. After the usual salutation, this motley assembly of visitors and professionals withdrew. His Reverence then said, "How are you, Mike?" To which Zosimus replied, "I'm dictating." What transpired we will not inquire, but this is certain, that he died in the full faith of his church and at peace with God and man. Zosimus died on Friday, the 3rd of April. The burial ticket was taken out on the 4th, and the interment took place on Palm Sunday.
My burying place to me is of no concern to me. In the O'Connell circle let it be. And as to my funeral, all pomp is vain. Illustrious people does prefer it plain.
The reader in that programme was Anne-Marie Horan. The contributor was Eamon Muckamosh, and the singer was Frank Hart. The programme was presented and produced by Pat Feeney. It's a